I never expected a deck repair job in a quiet cul-de-sac to change the way I thought about starting over, or about what it means to be really seen by someone who's still figuring out who they are after years of being someone for everyone else. I thought I was just showing up to fix warped boards and replace weathered railings, but instead, I met a woman who asked me a question that stuck in my chest like a nail half driven into wood. Is 46 too late to start over? This is the story of how that question led to a connection I didn't see coming and a bond that neither of us had planned for. But both of us needed more than we knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The job came in through a referral from a guy I'd done siding work for the previous spring. Said his sister needed someone reliable to repair an old deck out back of her place that had started sinking a little and creaking more than usual. It was mid-April, and the weather had just started to turn nice. Those crisp mornings, followed by sun-warmed afternoons that made you believe again in the rhythm of things. I pulled up to the address he gave me just before 9 a.m. Coffee still warm in the travel mug, and my tool bag in the passenger seat. The house was modest, a one-story with faded blue shutters and a porch swing that looked like it hadn't moved in years. I figured whoever lived here liked peace and quiet, or maybe just didn't want much to do with the outside world anymore. I knocked once, then twice, before the door cracked open. That's when I met her, Marianne. She was dressed in jeans and an oversized flannel shirt, hair loosely pulled back, no makeup, and this look in her eyes that felt both distant and cautious, like someone who'd just been pulled out of a long, deep thought. She nodded at me like she was expecting me to be taller, or maybe older. Then, without much small talk, led me around the side of the house, toward the backyard. The deck was in worse shape than I thought, wood splintering in places. 2 steps cracked clean down the center, and a faint lean toward the far corner, where the posts probably weren't holding like they used to. She stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching me as I crouched down to take a look. I made some mental notes about what needed replacing and what might just need reinforcing. Still hadn't said much. It's funny how you can feel someone's energy without them saying a word. Marianne didn't seem cold, just careful. Like someone used to people walking in and out of her life without really noticing her. Stood back up, dusted off my jeans, and gave her a basic rundown. She nodded, said, "Whatever you think is best," and turned back toward the house like the whole exchange hadn't meant anything at all. I got started that same day, beginning with removing the damaged steps. As I worked, I caught glimpses of her through the sliding glass doors, moving about the kitchen. Watering plants lined up on the sill. Once sitting at the table with her chin in her hand like she was watching a life play out that she wasn't part of anymore. Around noon, she came out with a pitcher of lemonade and a couple of glasses, said she figured I might want a break. That was the first time I heard her laugh, when I told her she didn't strike me as the lemonade type. Not she said, smiling just enough for the corners of her eyes to crinkle. But the mix was on sale. We sat for a while under the shade of an old oak tree that reached over a part of the yard. She asked about my work, how long I'd been doing it, if I liked it, if it paid well. I told her the truth. It wasn't glamorous, but there was something satisfying about fixing things. Something about taking what's broken and making it better. She nodded quietly, and I didn't ask her what she was thinking, but I could guess. Sometimes the quiet between two people says more than a full conversation. There was a kind of gravity to her that didn't pull you in fast, but if you stayed close long enough, you started to feel the weight of it. I came back the next day with more supplies and a plan to reinforce the beams underneath the deck. She met me at the door with a soft good morning and a half smile that wasn't quite sure of itself. It felt like a peace offering, like maybe she'd decided I wasn't just some guy passing through. I worked steadily through the morning, sweat dripping down my back, the buzz of the saw cutting through the still air. Every now and then, I'd catch her peeking through the curtain or stepping outside to ask if I needed anything. Each time, she lingered a little longer, her posture a little looser. By the end of day 2, the framework was more secure, and I was making good progress on the new railings. Marianne offered me dinner, Not just takeout, but something she'd cooked. Said it had been a while since she'd had someone to cook for. I didn't say anything, just nodded and accepted. We ate out on the back steps, plates balanced on our knees, sun setting low behind the trees. She told me about her garden plans, how she used to grow tomatoes and herbs when her kids were little, how the deck had once been the hub for birthday parties and summer dinners. That's when she told me she'd been divorced for 2 years. Said it plain, like she was talking about the weather. Her husband had moved out after 21 years of marriage, said he needed to find himself, and she was left behind to figure out what came next. She didn't cry, didn't even seem angry, just tired, like she'd been holding her breath for a long time and still hadn't decided whether it was safe to exhale. That night I left with a lot on my mind. There was something about Marianne that I couldn't shake. Not just the way she looked at me or how she carried herself, but the silence she lived in. It wasn't empty. It was full of something she hadn't let out yet, something waiting. And I couldn't help but wonder what it would look like if someone helped her let it out. The following morning, I found myself pulling into her driveway a few minutes early, and I wasn't sure if it was because I wanted to beat the heat or because something about this particular job made me feel like I had more purpose than usual. The deck was still just a deck on paper-rotted planks, warped railings. An unstable support system, but the quiet conversations, the carefully layered silences, and the way Marianne carried herself around it all made it feel like I was fixing something much older, much deeper than just old lumber. I grabbed my gear from the back of the truck, walked toward the house, and found her already waiting outside, arms wrapped around a mug of coffee. She greeted me with a smile that wasn't forced, and I took that as a small but solid sign that the air between us was beginning to shift, slow and cautious, like the turning of soil before new roots take hold. I started with sanding down the planks I hadn't yet replaced, and she sat nearby on a folding chair that looked like it had been dug out of storage just for the occasion. She didn't speak much at first, only sipped her coffee and watched. There wasn't any sense of awkwardness, though, just a calm rhythm between us, as if we had unknowingly stepped into a shared tempo. Occasionally, I'd glance up and catch her staring not at the deck, but at the trees, or the sky, or nothing. In particular, after about half an hour, she started talking not all at once, but gently, like letting something go that had been building up for a while. She told me she used to work in publishing, back when print still felt like a permanent thing. Said she gave it up to raise kids and follow her husband's career across cities, always packing and unpacking, always adapting. Her voice wasn't bitter, just reflective, like someone who had made peace with her choices, but not yet with what those choices had cost her. She mentioned her kids briefly, 2 of them, both grown now. One in Chicago, one in Portland. It's called once a week if she was lucky. She didn't say it to earn sympathy. It felt more like she was trying to account for all the things she had once, centered her life around that no longer needed her the way they used to. I listened, sanding in slow strokes, letting her words settle like dust on the air. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At one point, she laughed softly, almost to herself, and said that sometimes she wondered if she'd disappeared somewhere in her own story. That after years of being wife and mother and caretaker and homemaker, she didn't really know what the pages in her life looked like if she wasn't those things anymore. That sentence stuck with me more than I expected. It was a kind of truth I'd never heard said so plainly before. It reminded me how many people, especially women, reach middle age, not with excitement, but with a quiet ache for what was never truly theirs to begin with. She didn't ask for my thoughts, and I didn't offer them. It felt enough just to be there in that space, hearing her say the things she likely didn't say to anyone else. Later that afternoon, as I was hammering in some new railings, she returned from inside with a small tray water, some kind of sandwich, and a handwritten note folded neatly beside the plate. I raised an eyebrow, and she just smiled and set it down without a word. When she went back inside, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the note. It was simple, a few sentences scribbled in cursive that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. Thank you for making this space feel alive again. I didn't realize how much I needed that. I read it twice, then folded it back up and tucked it into my toolbox. Not quite ready to process what it meant or why it made something shift in my chest. The gesture wasn't romantic. It was personal, vulnerable, the kind of thank you that comes from somewhere deep, a place most people keep locked away. As the sun dipped behind the trees and I packed up for the day, she walked me to the side. Gate, we didn't say much, just exchanged a few words about the weather and how things were coming along. But right before I stepped through, she stopped me with a hand, gently brushing my sleeve. I turned and she hesitated like she was weighing whether or not to speak. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "I used to think I had it all figured out. But these days, I feel like I'm standing at the beginning again. Only I'm not sure where the path is anymore." I didn't know how to respond, not in that moment, not without saying too much or too little. So I just nodded. That seemed to be enough. She let go of my sleeve and stepped back, and I walked to my truck with the kind of heaviness that didn't come from tools or tired muscles. That night, I sat on my back porch with a beer and tried to replay our conversations in my head. Was something about Marianne that pulled at me, not in a romantic way, at least not yet, but in a way that made me want to understand her, to see who she was beneath the years of compromise and routine. I thought about how often people went unseen in their own lives, how easy it was to become a background character in a story that was supposed to be yours. Maybe that's why I kept showing up a little early, why I lingered a little longer. Not because I was falling for her, but because part of me was afraid she might fade away completely if no one noticed. The next day brought more work replacing deck boards, securing joists, sealing gaps, but it also brought something else. Shift. Marianne opened the door before I could knock, coffee already in hand, and she wore a different kind of energy, not loud or exuberant, but lighter. She walked with a bit more purpose, spoke with a bit more ease. As I set to work, she sat nearby, with a notebook in her lap, occasionally scribbling something down. I asked her what she was writing, and she said, almost sheepishly, "I used to write stories. Thought I'd see if I still remembered how." There was a glimmer in her eyes that hadn't been there before, like a long dormant ember flickering. Back to life. I didn't press, just smiled and told her I bet she hadn't forgotten a thing. As the day wore on, I found myself working slower, more deliberately. Not out of laziness, but because I didn't want to rush whatever this was taking shape between us. It wasn't romance, not exactly. It was something quieter, more meaningful, kind of connection that didn't demand anything but felt like it was giving both of us something we didn't know we needed. A reminder that life wasn't over just because the plans you made didn't work out. That sometimes starting over wasn't about finding someone new, but about finding the parts of yourself you'd left behind. By the fourth day, the deck was finally starting to look like something someone could enjoy again. The fresh planks ran evenly across the surface, secured tightly against the newly reinforced joists. The railings I'd installed added structure and symmetry that had long been missing. But even more than the deck taking shape, something else was shifting, to something that didn't come in wood or screws or stains. The woman who had met me days ago, with uncertainty in her posture and a cautious kind of silence, was now slowly unfurling like the leaves on the big oak tree above us. Reaching quietly for light, and as I worked, she stayed close, not hovering. Not intruding, just present. Her chair was always nearby, sometimes with a book, other times with her notebook. And once with a stack of old photographs she flipped through in the sunlight. Pausing now and then to trace the edge of one with her thumb, there was something deeply human about the way she engaged with the world, tentative yet curious, like someone relearning the rhythm of a language they hadn't spoken in years. I found myself working slower, not because I was tired or inefficient, but because the time spent in her presence carried a weight I didn't want to rush. It wasn't romantic, at least not in the obvious sense. It was something softer, something that asked you to pay attention. There was no push or pull, just the quiet settling of two people learning how to exist in the same space without pretending to be anyone but who they were. That morning, she had brought out a small box of items she said she'd been meaning to sort through for years. Inside were letters, a couple of old journals, Random keepsakes, a hospital bracelet, a concert stub, a dried-out rose pressed between two bookmarks. She laid them out on the deck floor beside me and said it was part of her unpacking. Not literal, but emotional. She said the idea of starting over at her age felt impossible because she didn't know where the starting line even was. "People say you can reinvent yourself," she murmured, running her fingers across the frayed edge of an envelope. "But what if you don't remember who you were before everything else took over?" It wasn't a question that needed an answer. It was one of those things you say aloud because it's been bouncing around in your chest for too long and you need to let it out. I didn't respond. Instead, I kept working on the final stair installation, letting the silence between us say whatever needed to be said. Still, the question stayed with me. I'd heard people talk about midlife reinvention like it was a neat and tidy process: change your hair, switch careers, sign up for a pottery class, but sitting next to Marianne and her box of forgotten moments, I understood how messy and uncertain that road could really be. It wasn't about hobbies or haircuts. It was about loss and memory and the aching. Realization that you'd given so much of yourself away without even realizing it. Later, in the afternoon, as we took a break under the shade of the tree, she asked if I'd ever thought about starting over. It caught me off guard, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I didn't expect her to ask. I told her that I thought about it more often than I let on, that I'd once been engaged years ago, but it fell apart before the wedding, and left me rethinking everything I thought I knew about myself. I told her that work had become my routine and my excuse, that fixing things for other people was easier than figuring out how to fix myself. She didn't interrupt or shift uncomfortably. She just listened, with that same focused stillness that made you feel like you were the only person in the world when her eyes were on you. There was a pause. And then she said, "You seem like someone who's good at finding broken things and making them whole again." I smiled at the compliment. But there was something in the way she said it that made me feel like she wasn't talking about decks or siding or railings. She was talking about people, about herself, about what she hoped maybe I could do for her, or what being around me was beginning to unlock inside her. I didn't know how to respond, so I thanked her and sipped my water and looked out across her overgrown backyard. There was a bird feeder hanging by a thread from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze. And I focused on that for a while because I wasn't ready to meet her gaze again. As I packed up my tools for the day, I found the same folded note she'd written before, tucked into a new sandwich bag she'd prepared. This one said, "I know I don't say much sometimes, but you make the quiet feel less empty." It was only 10 words, but it hit me harder than I expected. I folded the paper slowly, placed it in the side pocket of my tool bag, and stood for a moment before turning toward her. She was already watching from the doorway, arms crossed loosely, one foot tucked behind the other like she was balancing on an invisible line between caution and hope. I raised my hand in a small wave, and she returned it with a nod. No words, just recognition, an acknowledgement that something was growing between us. Not rushed, not labeled, just real. That night, I sat with my hands still dusty and my boots still on, thinking about how easy it is to go years without anyone seeing you. Not just noticing you, but really seeing you, the parts of you you've kept hidden or forgotten. Marianne had been a wife, a mother, a neighbor, a volunteer, a hostess, and 100 other roles. But now she was simply Marianne. And maybe for the first time in decades, that had to be enough. I thought about how lonely that must feel, and how brave it was to try and rediscover herself at 46. Society doesn't offer much grace for people, especially women who want to begin again past a certain age. It celebrates youth, glorifies reinvention when it's flashy, but rarely honors the quiet, private kind of starting over that happens in backyards and notebooks and long pauses. The next morning, she wasn't waiting for me at the door like she usually was. I knocked once, then twice, then let myself around back where I saw her already on the deck, barefoot, seated cross-legged on a blanket with her journal open in her lap. She looked up and smiled, not surprised, just content. "Didn't want to break the rhythm," she said as I stepped onto the newly installed steps. I nodded and got to work without much small talk. We spent the first hour in near silence, the only sounds being the rhythmic thud of my hammer and The occasional chirp of birds in the trees above. It was the kind of quiet that felt intentional, sacred even. Like we were both working on something invisible at the same time. By mid-morning, I'd finished sealing the wood and stepped back. To admire the progress, it wasn't just a deck anymore. It was a space that had been reclaimed, renewed. The foundation was solid again, and the surface strong enough to carry weight, not just physical, but emotional. Marianne walked over, barefoot still, and stood beside me with her arms crossed, and her head tilted slightly. "It's beautiful," she said softly. And then, as if the words had been resting on her tongue for days and she'd finally found the courage to let them go, she asked, "Is 46 too late to start over?" She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at the deck, the trees, the sky, anywhere but my eyes. Because sometimes asking that kind of question isn't really asking someone else. It's asking the universe for permission. And all I could think in that moment was, maybe starting over isn't about where you are or how old you are. Maybe it's just about choosing to stand still long enough to feel where you've been and taking one honest step forward. The question lingered between us like mist rising from warm ground after a cool morning. She didn't follow it up with anything, didn't ask what I thought, didn't try to explain why she'd asked it. Marianne simply stood there, gazing at the deck like it might give her an answer in the grain of the wood or the way the boards now lined up straight. And true, I didn't answer either, not immediately. I knew better than to rush past a moment like that. Some questions are sacred. They don't want solutions. They want space to exist out loud. So I let the silence stretch, not heavy, just honest. Stayed that way for a long while, the breeze brushing past us, the faint scent of cedar sealant still in the air, and the sound of leaves murmuring things we were too afraid to say. Eventually, she turned to me and smiled in a way that wasn't looking for reassurance, just connection, and then she disappeared into the house, leaving me there alone with the echoes of her question and the feeling that something important had just been spoken into the world. The rest of that day unfolded like a soft exhale. I packed up slowly, putting tools away with more care than usual. Glancing now and then at the sliding glass door in case she reappeared, she didn't. It felt like she had needed that moment on the deck to say something to herself more than to me. And once it had been said, she needed time to sit with it. I didn't take it personally. If anything, I respected it. Reminded me that starting over isn't a decision you make once, it's a process. A quiet unfolding, slow turning of pages that have been stuck together too long. As I drove away, that evening, I realized I hadn't even asked when she wanted me back. The job was nearly finished. There were a few final touches, some staining and cleanup, but the structure was sound and the work was done. Still, I had a feeling I'd be back not because the job required it, but because she would want me to be. Or maybe because I needed to be. I didn't hear from her for 3 days. During that time, I took a couple of smaller jobs patchwork, a stairwell refit, a garage cleanup hand each time. I caught myself thinking about her. It's not in the way a man thinks about someone he's falling for, but in the way a soul remembers a moment it wasn't prepared for but needed. I wondered if she was still writing in her notebook, if she was still sifting through that box of mementos. The question she'd asked was still sitting in her chest like it wasn't mine. I almost called, but I didn't. Instead, I waited. Some people need space after they expose a piece of their truth. And Marianne struck me as someone who had only recently learned how to breathe deeply again. On the 4th morning, I got a text. Just one line. Would love your help finishing the deck tomorrow if you're free. No smiley face, no punctuation, just that. And it was enough. I showed up early again, partly because I had nothing else scheduled, partly because I didn't. Want to leave her waiting? The house looked the same, but the energy felt different, lighter, brighter, like something had shifted inside, and the air had changed because of it. She opened the door before I could knock and stepped aside, motioning me in without a word. That was new. Up until then, we'd kept things to the porch and the yard, the deck, and the tools. But now she was inviting me into her space, into the rooms where the dust of her former life still clung quietly to. framed photos and shelves full of books that hadn't been touched in years. The living room was simple muted earth tones, a couch with a knit throw blanket, and a faint aroma of something citrusy in the air. Maybe a candle or cleaning product. She offered coffee, and we sat for a while at the kitchen table while it brewed. She seemed more settled, like someone who had stopped running not because she'd arrived anywhere, but because she'd grown tired of the chase. She told me she'd spent the last few days writing. Not stories, not yet, but memories. I figured before I start over I should know what I'm leaving behind, she said, stirring her cup slowly. There was no sadness in her voice, only clarity. I admired that. Most people try to outrun their past when they want a fresh start. Marianne was walking through hers, room by room, memory by memory, reclaiming it. We moved out to the deck around mid-morning. I touched up the sealant. On the edges, trimmed some uneven boards, and started installing the final set of rails. She worked beside me, pulling weeds from the garden bed that lined the yard, humming quietly to a tune I didn't recognize. Now and then, she'd pause to ask a question or share a thought that had clearly been brewing. Things like, do you think people can change without losing themselves? Or is comfort the same as happiness? She didn't expect answers. She just wanted someone to hear her wonder aloud. I was happy to be that person. Sometimes the most meaningful role you can play in someone's life is simply being there as they put language to what they've been carrying silently around noon. She disappeared for a moment and returned with sandwiches again, this time with a different note. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I tucked it into my pocket, deciding to read it later, alone. There was something ceremonial about her notes, like tiny confessions folded into paper and sealed with intention. We sat on the finished edge of the deck and ate in silence, watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. It felt like the end of something, but not in a final way more, like the closing of a chapter that had been years in the making. When I stood to stretch, she looked up at me and said, "Thank you for helping me find something I thought I'd lost." I nodded, unsure what else to say, and we stood together in that quiet understanding. Before I left that day, she handed me an envelope, slightly thicker than the others. "This is the last one," she said, her eyes not quite meeting mine. I waited until I got home to open it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 3 pages long. In it, she told me about the day her husband left and how she'd sat on that very deck, trying to imagine what life without him would look like. How, at the time, she couldn't see anything past that moment. How the years since had felt like drifting untethered and unclaimed. She wrote about the loneliness, about the silence in the house after her children had gone, and about the fear that maybe she'd already lived all the meaningful parts of her life. And then she wrote about me not in a romantic way, but in the way you write about someone who reminded you what it meant to be seen. She said that the work I did with my hands gave her the courage to begin again with her heart, that watching me build something steady and solid helped her believe she could do the same inside herself. "Thank you," the letter ended, "for not rushing me, for letting me unfold." As I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, I realized that starting over isn't something you do once, something you do every time you choose to believe that your life still has unwritten pages. Marianne hadn't found all her answers, and I hadn't solved any mysteries. But we had shared something rare, a quiet restoration. It's the kind that doesn't announce itself, but roots itself deep and steady, like the foundation of a well-built deck. The next few days passed quietly. I busied myself with other small projects, patching drywall for an elderly couple on the other side of town, assembling a pergola for a family who insisted on offering lemonade every 30 minutes. But no matter how much I filled my calendar, there was a lingering sense that something had shifted permanently in my routine. I found myself checking my phone more often than usual, not necessarily waiting for a message from Marianne, but hoping. For one, just the same. The silence from her didn't feel like distance, it felt like a space being honored. She'd said what she needed to say, and I'd received it without needing to push for more. But still, it amazed me how someone could step into your life for just a few days and leave behind a presence strong enough to ripple through everything after. On the 4th morning, I drove by her street without meaning to. I was on my way too. Another job, but my truck seemed to turn left out of habit, and suddenly I was slowing as her mailbox came into view. Her car was there. Same spot. The curtains drawn back slightly on the living room window. I didn't stop. I just passed by slowly, a quiet acknowledgement, a kind of check-in without knocking. It was enough to know she was there, that her story was still unfolding inside that house, even if I wasn't part of the pages today. When I reached my job site, I worked faster than usual, channeling some kind of energy I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was momentum. Maybe it was restlessness. Either way, my hands moved with purpose, and by sundown, I was back on my porch with a drink in hand, staring out at nothing in particular and thinking about what it really meant to begin again. It wasn't until the weekend that I heard from her. Text, short and simple. Would love to show you something. No tools required. That was all it said. I read it twice, then a third time, as if there were a hidden meaning tucked between the words. I replied that I'd be there in an hour, and true to form, I arrived 10 minutes early. When she opened the door, she looked different, not in any dramatic way, but lighter somehow, like she'd been spending more time in the sun. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore a soft linen blouse that fluttered slightly in the breeze drifting in from the open windows. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. She welcomed me inside with a nod, and I followed her through the living room into what used to be a cluttered spare room. But it wasn't cluttered anymore. The walls had been repainted a gentle sage green, and the floor was clear, except for a desk in the corner and a small armchair beside the window. Her notebooks were stacked neatly on one end of the desk, a laptop on the other. A framed photograph sat in the middle, a much younger version of Marianne, standing barefoot on a beach, hair wild in the wind, holding a pen like it was a sword. She watched me take it all in and said softly, "I've decided to write again. Really write. Not just memories, stories, fiction, all the things I used to dream about when I thought I had time." I turned to her, and she shrugged, as if to say she wasn't sure it would lead anywhere, but she was ready to follow it anyway. It struck me then that this was the beginning she'd been searching for, not some grand reinvention or wild new chapter, but a return. A quiet reclaiming of something she'd buried to survive the years. We sat in that room for a long while, talking about the books we loved, the stories that had shaped us, the characters we carried in our hearts. She confessed that she used to write late into the night when her children were asleep, typing with the light of her laptop turned low so as not to wake them. "Thought I'd come back to it when life calmed down," she said. But life never really calms down, does it? You just have to claim the time. That line stuck with me. You have to claim the time. It echoed in my mind like a mantra, and I found myself repeating it under my breath days later when my own thoughts got noisy. She was right. Time doesn't present itself with a ribbon. You take it, you carve it out, you protect it. And starting over doesn't wait for permission. It waits for courage. After that visit, we fell into a gentle rhythm. We didn't see each other every day, but when we did, it was with purpose. Sometimes I'd stop by with no tools at all, just a pair of coffees and a shared hour on the deck. Other times, she'd invite me in to read a paragraph she was proud of, or to ask my opinion on a scene she wasn't sure how to end. I never pretended to be an expert, but I listened like one. It became clear that this wasn't about critique. It was about bearing witness, giving her voice a place to land. Each time I sat across from her, I saw less of the woman who had once asked me if 46 was too late, and more of the woman who had decided the question no longer mattered. She wasn't starting over. She was starting now. As weeks passed, summer deepened. The trees thickened their canopies, the deck weathered slightly under the sun, and the notebook stacks on her desk grew taller. One afternoon, she handed me a printed short story, 12 pages, double-spaced, titled The Weight of Silence. I read it on her porch while she busied herself inside, pretending not to be watching from the window. The story wasn't perfect. Some sentences rambled, some endings felt abrupt, but it had heart. Real, aching heart. It told the story of a woman who had once been many things to many people, and who now, in the solitude of middle age, was learning to be something for herself. I didn't need to ask if it was autobiographical. Truth pulsed through every word. When I finished, I set the pages on my lap and looked up at the trees. I thought about how many people live quiet lives full of buried stories, go unheard because someone somewhere convinced them that their time had passed. But sitting there, I realized Marianne's voice wasn't just returning, it was rising, and I felt strangely honored to be one of the first to hear it. That evening, just before I left, she stopped me by the gate. Her hand brushed mine, not deliberately, but not accidentally either. She looked up and said, "Thank you for showing up." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't coded. It was simply the truth. Sometimes the deepest impact we make in someone's life isn't through what we say or do, it's through our presence. I had shown up day after day, hammering, sanding, listening, witnessing, and in doing so, I had unknowingly helped her remember the sound of her own name. The following week brought rain, steady misting kind that blanketed the town for days and made everything slow down to the rhythm of water, tapping on roofs and gathering in gutters. I wasn't working much. Most of my jobs were exterior ones, and instead found myself puttering around my own place, fixing the little things I'd been ignoring, oiling the hinges that creaked, organizing the garage that had become a graveyard of half-used paint cans and scattered screws. Yet in between all of it, my thoughts drifted off into Marianne's house, to the green-walled room with the worn desk and the photo of her younger self defiantly holding a pen. I imagined her at that desk now, curled up in that old cardigan. She liked a mug of tea beside her, fingers flying over her keyboard as the rain painted her windows with shifting shadows. She hadn't texted again since she gave me her short story, and I hadn't reached out either. It wasn't out of hesitation or disinterest, it was something quieter, more respectful, like we were both giving the story room to breathe. There's a kind of stillness that happens after something meaningful is shared, like the pause after a deep breath, and we were both resting in it. Sometimes connections grow not in constant contact, but in the space between. When you know the other person is still there, still thinking of you in their own way, you don't need the reassurance of daily messages. You trust the thread hasn't frayed, that the distance is just a natural part of the rhythm. The rain finally broke on the 6th day, and the sky opened with a clarity that made the whole neighborhood shimmer, every surface washed clean. I decided to take a walk that morning, something I rarely did for no reason. My steps, maybe out of habit, maybe by something deeper, guided me toward her street again. As I turned the corner, I saw her in the yard, kneeling by a cluster of overgrown roses near the edge of the property. She wore gloves and a light jacket, and her hair was pulled back with a scarf tied at the nape of her neck. She looked up as I approached, unsurprised, and gave me a small smile, as if she'd been expecting me all along. I offered to help, and, without saying much, she handed me a second pair of gloves and motioned toward the weeds tangled beneath the rose bushes. We worked side by side in quiet rhythm, occasionally brushing shoulders as we reached for fallen branches or loosened soil. Around stubborn roots, there was something meditative about it, the way shared physical tasks can fill the silence with meaning. The roses, once hidden under layers of neglect, began to show themselves against small blooms, tight with potential, poking through thorns and old stems. As we cleared more space, she told me she hadn't touched this garden in nearly 2 years. Said it reminded her too much of things she didn't have the energy to feel at the time. I didn't ask what those things were. I didn't need to. Pause in her voice said enough. When we finished, we sat on the edge of the deck, muddy and quiet, sipping water and watching the breeze stir the freshly exposed flowers. She glanced at me and said, "I submitted my story. Just to a local online magazine, nothing major." Her voice held a blend of pride and uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure she had permission to be proud. I smiled and told her she didn't need anyone's permission. That moment felt like a small victory, not just for her, but for anyone who's ever tried to speak again after years of silence. She was doing it, not performing transformation, not chasing reinvention, but choosing herself. In the quiet corners of her days, she was writing, tending, rebuilding. Later that evening, I received another envelope. It had been tucked into my glove while I wasn't looking. I found it when I got home, smeared a little with garden dirt. Inside was another letter, shorter this time, a single page. She'd written about the roses, how they'd once been her favorite part of the yard, how she planted them the spring after her second child was born, how they'd been a symbol once of growth and promise, and how over time they'd become a kind of burden. Something beautiful she could no longer care for. Today, I remembered how good it feels to dig in the dirt, she wrote. To be grounded. I think I've been floating too long. That last line sat with me long after I folded the paper and placed it beside the others. We don't often think about how much of life is spent untethered, floating from one expectation to the next, one identity to another. But Marianne had found the ground again, and in doing so, she was learning to stand. A few days later, she texted again this time with a picture. It was of her backyard, the deck bathed in golden light, the rose bushes standing tall and in the center. A small round table with two mismatched chairs pulled close together. The caption read, "Thinking of hosting a dinner? Just us? Interested?" I stared at the message longer than necessary, letting the simplicity of it soak in. There was something intimate about that. Invite, not romantic. Not loaded, just honest. A dinner. A thank you. Continuation of the slow unfolding that had become our strange, quiet bond. I replied that I'd bring dessert and a bottle of wine. The night of the dinner, the weather was perfect cool, but not cold. The kind of breeze that carried the scent of the garden and the distant sound of wind chimes. She had set the table with intentional nin napkins, candles in old glass jars, mismatched plates that somehow looked like they belonged together. She wore a soft dress, one I hadn't seen before, and greeted me with that familiar half-smile that said everything without needing to speak. We ate slowly, savoring each bite, talking about everything and nothing: books, childhood, fears we didn't often name. She told me about a story she was working on now, something fictional but close to her heart. I told her about a cabin I used to visit as a kid, where my dad taught me how to use a hammer, and how silence wasn't something to be feared. As the night deepened, she lit more candles and pulled a blanket over her lap. We stayed out long past. When the dishes were cleared, just talking, the kind of conversation that meanders and loops and doubles back, full of pauses that aren't awkward but natural. She told me she didn't know what the future looked like, didn't have a clear picture of where she was heading. But for the first time, she said, "That doesn't scare me." I understood that in a way I hadn't before. The point of starting over wasn't to chart a new course with perfect precision, simply to allow yourself the chance to rediscover wonder, to admit you don't have it all figured out, and that's okay. When I finally stood to leave me to the gate, we didn't hug, we didn't say too much, but there was something in the way we looked at each other, something steady and true, and knowing, no matter where her path took her next. No matter how many more stories she wrote or how far her voice traveled, we had shared this chapter, and it mattered. Maybe not in the way the world measures things, in grand gestures or declarations, but in quiet presence. Shared growth and the restoration of something long buried. And that, I realized, was more than enough. I didn't see Marianne for a little. While after that night, it wasn't because anything was wrong or that we had drifted apart. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people trust that nothing is being lost in the space between them. Some chapters in life aren't meant to be read aloud every day. They're felt in the pauses, lived in the in-between. I went back to my regular jobs, the ones that required less thought and more muscle. I found that even in the ordinary repetition of sanding wood or patching up cracked tiles, there was something different in me now. It was subtle, like a longer breath before starting something, or the way I noticed sunlight more often in places I hadn't looked for it before. My routines hadn't changed much, but the way I moved through them had. Layer had been peeled back, and underneath was a softness I hadn't remembered having. One afternoon, while loading plywood into my truck, I got a notification. Marianne had tagged me in a post. That was new. She hadn't used social media much before. Opened it with curiosity and found a photo of the finished deck, clean polished, surrounded by green and blooming rose bushes, and in the caption, she'd written, "Sometimes you don't start over by running away. Sometimes you start by inviting someone into the mess with you." My name was there in simple thanks, but it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement that the story we had shared had shaped her, and she wasn't afraid to say it out loud. I read the caption several times, letting the weight of it settle. It wasn't public for the sake of being public. It was an act of owning her journey, letting others see her transformation, not because she owed them anything, but because she no longer needed to hide the process. A few hours later, I got a message from her, short, as usual. "If you're around tomorrow, I'd love your help hanging a few things in the writing room." I replied that I'd be there in the morning, and I was. She met me at the door wearing paint-stained sweats and a contented smile, and I followed. Her back to the room that had grown from a dusty spare space into something warm and lived in. There were prints to be framed, floating shelves to mount, a small cork board she'd picked up secondhand that she wanted to fill with quotes. Scraps, little reminders of who she was becoming. I got to work while she sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through papers and humming some unfamiliar melody. The walls felt different now, like they were holding her voice, like her stories had soaked into the paint. We didn't talk much. During that time, she was in her own flow, and I was content to just be there, tools in hand, letting the rhythm of work ground me again. At one point, she handed me a print that stopped me for a second. It was a simple design, black script on cream background, that read, "Your story is not over just because the chapter changed." She noticed the pause and smiled gently. "That one's for me," she said, but we both knew it was also for anyone who had ever stood on the edge of something unfamiliar and wondered if it was too late to begin again. Later, after everything was hung and the light in the room had grown golden with the late afternoon sun, we sat down at the little round table on the deck and shared a quiet drink. The garden had taken on a life of its own since we last spent time out. Their birds darted between branches, and the air smelled of lavender and rosemary. She told me about a writers' group she was thinking of joining, and how she wasn't sure if she belonged yet. I told her she probably did and didn't have to wait for anyone else to confirm it. She nodded, not entirely convinced, but willing to try. There was something in her eyes that reminded me of the first time I saw her through the kitchen window, thoughtful, curious, but hesitant to let too much be seen. And yet here we were, sitting on the deck we had built together, surrounded by the life she was slowly choosing to reclaim. As the sky shifted to twilight and the wind picked up, I could feel that something had turned a corner, not just in her, but in me too. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd poured into other people's lives over the years, building for them, fixing for them, stepping in where there was brokenness. And I didn't mind it. It gave me purpose. But I had often forgotten to tend to my own story, to pause long enough to ask myself the questions I helped others answer. Marianne, without knowing it, had reminded me that even those who build for others need to rebuild themselves sometimes. That presence, quiet and consistent, can be just as healing as action. That night, after I left her house and drove the familiar road back to mine, I passed by the lake just outside town. I don't know why I pulled over. Maybe it was the way the moon reflected off the water, or the stillness that settled over everything like a blanket. I got out of the truck and stood by the edge for a long while, just listening, thinking. I remembered being 21, standing in this same spot, overwhelmed by the weight of everything I didn't know about life. Now, years later, I stood there again, not necessarily wiser, but quieter inside, more accepting of the not knowing, more willing to let the story unfold instead of rushing to finish it. I thought about Marianne, how she'd asked me that first day if 46 was too late to start over. And now I knew the answer. Not because I'd said it, but because I'd witnessed it. It's never too late. The truth is, starting over isn't about age. It's about readiness. About the moment you stop running from your story and start living inside it again. When I got home that night, I opened the drawer in my desk where I kept all her letters. I hadn't read them again since she gave them to me, but something pulled me toward them now. One by one, I unfolded the pages and let her words wash over me. They weren't polished. They weren't always clear. Honest, aching, searching. And I realized that they were more than just letters. They were mile markers on her journey back to herself. And in reading them again, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. She hadn't just been telling me her story. She'd been inviting me to reflect on mine, to pause, to consider, to feel. That was the gift she gave me without expectation, without needing anything in return. The next morning, I started writing something of my own, nothing elaborate. Just a paragraph about a man standing on the edge of a lake, thinking about how stillness doesn't mean stagnation. I didn't know where it would go or if I'd ever finish it. But for the first time in years, I felt like putting something into words. Not for anyone else, just for me. Maybe that's how it begins. It's a slow return, the gentle reclaiming, a story inside a story, unfolding without hurry, without needing to impress. It's simply existing because it wants to be told. The week that followed was quiet in the best possible way. The kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from something unfolding beneath the surface. I kept working on my usual rotation of jobs, moving from one house to another, sanding railings, placing screens, hauling wood through sunlit yards that smelled of freshly cut grass. But the work felt different now. I wasn't just patching things up out of routine. I was paying attention to the sound of birds in the trees above me, to the way the sun cast patterns through old porch beams, to how people spoke when they thought no one was really listening. I started keeping a little notepad in my truck. First, it was just for writing down materials I needed to grab from the hardware store. But soon I found myself jotting down fragments of thoughts, sentences that came from nowhere, scenes that felt like they belonged to something not yet written. I didn't know if it was Marianne's influence or just a part of myself waking up again after lying dormant for too long. Either way, I wasn't ignoring it this time. I heard from Marianne. Again, on a Thursday, a voice message this time, which was new. Her voice came through soft but certain, saying she was thinking of going away for a weekend writing retreat and asking if I'd be able to help her move some furniture before she left. I told her, of course, and 2 days later I pulled up to her place just before noon. The sky was overcast, the kind of pale gray that makes colors pop in contrast. And as I stepped out of the truck, I noticed how alive her garden looked. Not in a manicured way, but like it had been encouraged to grow wildly, fully, without fear of overstepping its bounds. It suited her. The deck was clean, the paint now fully cured, the wood warm underfoot as she stepped out to greet me. She wore jeans and a loose white button-up, her sleeves rolled, hair tucked behind her ears. She looked peaceful, even a little giddy, like someone standing at the threshold of something long awaited. She led me inside, where we rearranged her living room to make space for a new bookshelf she had thrifted, its wood faded but strong, edges scuffed in a way that told stories of its past homes. She planned to fill it with her favorite novels, old journals, and eventually, she said, copies of her own published work. She said it jokingly, but I could tell she meant it more than she let on. As we worked, she told me more about the retreat. It wasn't fancy, a cabin 2 towns over with a handful of other writers she'd met online, most of whom were also starting later in life. The group was small, intimate. A mix of storytelling, shared meals, and long stretches of solitude where everyone was encouraged to disappear into their own world. It sounds like something I would have been too scared to try even just a year ago, she said. But now I don't know, it feels right. I nodded, not because I knew what it was like to go on a writing retreat, but because I understood what it meant to do something that once felt out of reach and now felt necessary. When we were done moving things around, we ended up sitting on the floor, backs against the newly placed bookshelf, sharing a quiet moment in the space that had been transformed by more than just furniture. I asked her how she was feeling, really, and she paused before answering, like I'm standing at the start of a trail I used to walk a long time ago, and even though I don't know where it leads anymore, I'm not afraid to follow it. That line settled deep in my chest because I think most people don't realize when they've stopped walking their own trail. They just wake up one day and realize how far they've drifted from themselves. Marianne wasn't drifting anymore. She was walking with intention, one step at a time, and she wasn't asking for a map. We talked a while longer, about little things, mostly her plans for the garden come spring, a new recipe she wanted to try, a neighbor's dog that kept digging holes under her fence, but underneath. The light conversation was a current of something more. A quiet knowing that time was moving forward and something was beginning to shift. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door and held my gaze for a moment longer than usual. "Thank you," she said, and she didn't need to say what for. I nodded and told her to enjoy the retreat. And then I drove off with the image of her standing in the doorway, sunlight pooling around her feet like an invitation to something new. That weekend, didn't hear from her and I didn't expect. 2. I imagined her tucked away in a cabin, surrounded by trees and other voices chasing their own stories. I pictured her at a wooden desk, sipping tea, her fingers dancing over the keys as sentences took shape and characters found their way into existence. The thought made me smile in the middle of an otherwise mundane Saturday, where I was sanding, paying off a garage door for a client who'd told me all about her upcoming cruise, but never once asked how I was doing. I didn't mind. Not everyone's meant to know your story. Some people are just background characters in a chapter you're not going to reread. Thinking of Marianne reminded me that not every connection has to be loud or intense to be meaningful. Some arrive quietly, stay gently, and leave you forever changed. When she returned a few days later, she called me, not with a task or a request, but just to talk. Her voice was lighter than I remembered, like something had been unburdened. She told me the retreat had been everything she'd hoped for and nothing she could have predicted. There were tears, laughter, silence, breakthroughs. She read her story aloud for the first time to people who weren't just friends, but fellow storytellers, and the response had left her speechless. One woman told me she saw herself in my character, she said, that it made her feel less alone. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had a tremble I hadn't heard before. I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing. That night, I found myself back by the lake, same spot I'd stopped at weeks before. The wind was calm, the surface of the water like glass. I thought about the version of myself that had come here at 21, then again last month, and now here I was against a man, but different somehow. I'd spent so many years measuring progress by the things I could build, the tasks I could complete. But watching Marianne grow into her own voice had taught me something quieter and maybe even more powerful. Progress isn't always about movement. Sometimes it's about stillness, about listening, about giving space for someone else's story to unfold beside your own without needing to control it or name it. And maybe that's what starting over really means. Not wiping the slate clean or rewriting your life, but choosing to stay open. To let something beautiful grow where there was once only silence. The days that followed were filled with a gentle rhythm. One that felt more like a current carrying us both downstream, rather than something either of us had to actively steer. Marianne and I didn't see each other every day, but there was a constancy in our communication, now short messages. Voice notes, the occasional picture of her desk scattered with papers and half-filled coffee mugs. She told me once in a voice message, I don't know if I'm writing for an audience or just excavating parts of myself I buried a long time ago. I told her that maybe they were the same thing. Writing, like repairing, was about getting to what lies beneath, facing it, and trying to give it shape again. That seemed to sit well with her. One afternoon, she sent me a draft of a new piece, this time not a story, but something more like a personal essay. It was about her first year after the divorce, raw, honest, and sharp around the edges. I read it 3 times, each time slower, feeling the ache behind her carefully chosen words. She wasn't writing to be admired. She was writing because silence had stopped serving her. And somewhere in the margins of that document, I saw a woman reclaiming her voice in the exact way she had taught herself to suppress it years before. That same week, got a job request from someone in a nearby neighborhood. It wasn't much, some minor repairs on a railing and replacing cracked boards on a porch, but the house was only a few blocks from Marianne's. As I worked, I found myself glancing up at the street every so often, half expecting to see her walking by. I didn't, but the habit of looking told me more than I needed to admit. There's something unspoken that happens when someone begins to take up residence in your thoughts, not because they demand it, but because their presence has started to feel like a part of your internal landscape. I wasn't rushing toward any conclusion about us, but I knew enough to recognize that what we had wasn't just friendship built on circumstance. It was rooted in something steadier, something that had been growing not with heat and fire, but with time and light and patience. It wasn't grand gestures or declarations. It was small consistencies, quiet encouragements, and mutual witnessing. A few days later, she invited me over for breakfast. Not a fancy one, just eggs, toast, and black coffee on the back deck. The air was brisk that morning, but not unpleasant, and we both wore light jackets as we sat under the soft morning sun. The garden had settled into its light spring rhythm, and a few bees hovered lazily over the open roses. She had her notebook beside her plate, closed, but within reach. She seemed more grounded than usual, that day less in her head, more present in her body. She asked how my projects were going, what I was working on next. And I told her about a client who wanted to turn their garage into a home office, but didn't want to spend too much. A familiar problem, she said, smiling. Right. Creating space for growth on a tight budget? I laughed and told her it was a metaphor waiting to be written. She didn't say anything for a moment, just nodded, looking out at the yard with a softness in her eyes. After breakfast, she asked if I had time to help her move a few boxes from the attic. I said sure, and we climbed the narrow stairs to a space filled with dust, cobwebs, and the smell of old cardboard and insulation. It was the kind of attic that hadn't been visited in years, and most of the boxes were labeled with dates, names or cryptic titles like Christmas Misc, and books, maybe. We carried them down one by one, stacking them in her hallway, and then sat cross-legged on the floor, opening them slowly like archaeologists uncovering forgotten artifacts. There were old baby clothes, photo albums, school projects, and letters from people whose names she hadn't spoken in years. As she sifted through them, I saw a quiet transformation in her expression, not grief, exactly, but a kind of gentle reckoning. She was facing her past with the kind of grace people only develop after they've stopped being afraid of what they'll find in one of the boxes. She pulled out a stack of papers stapled together, an old manuscript she'd started in her 20s and never finished. The title was handwritten in black marker on the front page, The Unraveling. She laughed when she saw it, shaking her head. I thought I had it all figured out back then, she said. Turns out I was just getting started. She handed it to me, and I scanned the first few paragraphs. The writing was raw, unpolished, but full of potential. I told her so, and she smiled, almost sheepishly, as if some part of her had still been waiting all this time for someone to say that. Maybe I'll finish it one day, she said. Not because it needs to be finished, but because I want to see how it ends. That line stayed with me the rest of the day. It echoed in my head like a truth I hadn't known I was waiting to hear. So many of us leave things unfinished, not just stories, but parts of ourselves. And maybe we never go back to them because we're afraid they'll no longer make sense, or that we won't recognize the person who began them. But what if returning isn't about resolution? What if it's just about honoring who we were and choosing, finally, to keep going? That night, I sat on my own deck with a beer in hand and the sounds of summer beginning to stir in the trees. I thought about the attic, the dusty boxes, the manuscript with its faded cover. I thought about the way Marianne had looked at it, not with regret, but with curiosity. And I wondered what unfinished things I had tucked away in the corners of my life. Not just the literal ones, the half-built cabinet in my garage or the travel journal with only 3 pages filled, but the emotional ones. The conversations never had, the apologies never given, the risks never taken. I didn't have an answer that night, but for the first time in a long while, I was willing to ask the questions. Over the next few weeks, things didn't speed up between us, but they didn't slow down either. We found a rhythm, one that felt like home, not rushed, not uncertain, just rooted. She'd send me updates about her writing, sometimes asking for feedback, other times just wanting someone to share the small victories with. I started writing. Mostly for myself, in that same notepad I kept in the truck. I wasn't trying to become anything. I just liked the way it made me feel present, attentive, awake to the world in a way I hadn't been in years, and somewhere in the overlap of her stories and mine. We were building something slow and real and entirely our own. The first time Marianne asked me to read something in person, We were sitting in her newly organized writing room on a quiet Wednesday evening. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the window box outside, and she had just made tea, something herbal and earthy that she said helped her focus. She slid the printed pages across the table like they were something sacred, something delicate. She wasn't quite ready to hand over, but knew she had to. "It's not finished," she said, almost as a disclaimer, her fingers nervously tapping the corner of the paper. I took it slowly, gave her a nod, and began reading. The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional shift in my chair. As I read, I felt myself pulled into her rhythm, the way her words unfolded gently but with purpose. How the narrator, clearly a mirror of herself, navigated the grief of unmet expectations while slowly discovering that life doesn't need a blueprint to be beautiful. There was a section that caught me off guard, something about walking away from who you thought you were supposed to be so you could finally stand still, long enough to figure out who you actually are. That one hit me in the chest. When I finished, I looked up and found her watching me, anxious but hopeful. "It's honest," I said, and brave. Looked down, a flush coloring her cheeks, and whispered, "I'm trying." It wasn't the kind of writing meant to shock or dazzle. It was the kind that lingers, that makes you look inward without realizing you've done so. I told her that, and she smiled in a way that made it clear those words mattered more than she'd let on. She folded the pages back into her notebook and exhaled, as if just the act of letting someone else hold her work had lightened a weight she'd been carrying alone. We sat in that room for a long time after, not needing to fill the space with anything else did sometimes. The silence between two people says more than conversation ever could. In the weeks that followed, she started calling me more. Not for help with anything, just to share little updates, stories from her writing group, bits of inspiration she'd found in random places like a line from an old movie or a comment from a stranger at the grocery store. Her world was widening, and I could feel it happening in real time. And somewhere along the way, I realized that mine was too. I wasn't just showing up for work anymore. I was showing up for life again. Not the loud kind of living that demands attention, but the quiet, steady kind that feels like returning to yourself after being away for too long. Then one Saturday morning, as I was walking through the local hardware store, I got a text from her. It was a photo of her holding a freshly printed flyer with her name listed as a featured reader at a local storytelling event. Beneath it, she'd written, "What am I doing?" followed by 3 panicked emojis. I laughed out loud in the middle of aisle 4 and texted back, "You're doing the thing you said you'd never be brave enough to do," she replied a minute later. "Will you come?" Didn't need to think twice. Of course. The event was held in the back room of a small bookstore downtown, the kind with uneven floors and shelves stacked too high, and that soft hum of stories lingering in the air. The room was filled with people, some eager, some awkward, most clutching notepads or books. When Marianne stepped up to the microphone, she looked calm from a distance, but I could see the way her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded her pages. She glanced around the room once, found my eyes, and then began to read. Her voice wavered at first, but with each paragraph, it gained strength. The story she shared was familiar, the one she'd let me read, but it landed differently. Out loud, it was alive now, breathing through the room, connecting strangers through shared vulnerability. When she finished, the applause came slowly at first, then grew, sincere and sustained. She smiled, not just with her mouth, but with her whole being, and I saw something shift inside her. She wasn't just a woman who wrote anymore. She was a writer. Afterward, she found me near the coffee table at the back of the room. She looked radiant, flushed with adrenaline and disbelief.
"I
did it," she said, her voice hushed but electric. "You did," I said, "and you belonged up there." She shook her head, overwhelmed but glowing. I was terrified. I smiled. "That's how you know it mattered." We stayed a while longer, chatting with the other attendees, flipping through books, sipping too strong coffee from paper cups. She introduced me to a few of the other writers as the one who rebuilt my deck and helped me rebuild myself. And I wasn't sure which part she meant more. Maybe both. Driving home that night, I thought about how far she'd come in such a short time. But more than that, I thought about how far we'd both traveled in our own ways, side by side. There had never been a moment where we sat down and defined what we were to each other. No labels, no promises, just presence. That had been enough. But still, there was a part of me that wondered what came next. Not because I needed more, but because the story felt like it was gently shifting again, not ending. Just turning a page. A few days later, she called and asked if I'd meet her at the lake, the same one I'd stopped by more than once in the past few months. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on the dock with her shoes off, feet dangling just above the water. Gosh. I joined her without saying a word. We sat there in the stillness, watching the late afternoon sun glitter across the lake's surface. After a while, she spoke. I used to think starting over meant burning everything down, that it had to be this big dramatic shift. But now I think it's more like this. Quiet, intentional, one small brave choice at a time. Nodded, like deciding to read your story in front of a room full of strangers. She smiled. Exactly. There was a long pause. Then she turned to me, her voice softer than the wind, and said, "Do you ever think about how all this started with a broken deck?" I chuckled. "I think about that a lot, actually. It's funny," she said. "I was so afraid to ask for help that day. Now here we are, I echoed. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the dock. And for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at peace with not knowing what the next chapter would hold. It was enough to be here, in this moment, with her. No expectations. No need to define it. It's just two people who had found each other in the middle of rebuilding something, maybe not just a deck. But parts of themselves they'd forgotten were still standing. The season began to change slowly, almost unnoticeably. At first, like a whisper of cooler air at dusk, or the slight dimming of daylight before dinner. Summer had not yet loosened its grip entirely, but there were signs everywhere that autumn was preparing its gentle arrival. The leaves on Marianne's trees held a stubborn green, but the tips were flirting with gold. Her deck, once raw and weathered, now looked seasoned and settled, like it had always belonged there, like it had grown with the house. I stopped by one morning just to drop off some leftover wood sealant I thought she might use for touch-ups, not intending to stay. But when I reached the porch, I found her sitting in the wicker chair with a mug in her hands. Eyes closed, face tilted toward the morning sun. She didn't open her eyes when she greeted me, just smiled and motioned for me to sit. I did. We sat for a long time without words. It was the kind of silence that had grown between us, not awkward, not expectant, just still. She eventually opened her eyes and looked over at me. "I've been thinking about moving," she said. The words were clear, but not heavy. She didn't say them like someone running away. She said them like someone who had outgrown the walls around her and was curious about what came next. I didn't react immediately. I just nodded, letting the idea settle in. "Where to?" I asked eventually. "I don't know," she said with a small laugh. "Somewhere quieter, maybe farther out, maybe a smaller place. It's just me, my books, and a really big desk." Sipped her tea and added, "But I haven't decided yet. It's just a feeling for now." I asked her if she thought she'd miss this place. She looked around slowly, her gaze moving across the yard, the garden, the weathered shed, and the corner. "I've loved it," she said, "but I think I'm done loving it." Does that make sense? It did. More than she probably realized. We're not always meant to love things forever. Sometimes we love them just long enough to learn something, to remember who we are, and then we move on, not because we're ungrateful, but because the lesson is complete. I helped her trim some overgrown hedges that morning, and we fell into our usual easy rhythm. We worked in comfortable silence, occasionally, breaking it with comments about the stubborn roots or the unexpected heat. There was a quiet harmony in the way our movements aligned. How she handed me tools before I even asked for them, and how I instinctively knew when to pause so she could catch her breath. It felt like a metaphor for everything we'd been building. Together in spoken understanding, a rhythm without rehearsal. Afterward, she brought out cold lemonade, and we sat again, watching the wind move through the trees. "Have you ever thought about moving?" she asked me. The question surprised me. I'd lived in the same small house on the edge of town for over a decade. It was modest, a little too quiet some nights, but it was mine. I told her I hadn't really thought about it seriously. "Maybe you should," she said softly. "Not because you need to, but because maybe it's time to let yourself want something different." Her words stuck with me long after I left that afternoon. I drove home the slow way, past roads I didn't usually take, through neighborhoods that weren't on my usual route. I looked at houses, not with the eyes of a handyman evaluating porches or siding, but as a man imagining a different life, one with new rooms. Unfamiliar views, windows that faced a rising sun instead of a setting one. I didn't come to any conclusions, but I noticed something shift. I wasn't dismissing the thought anymore. I was allowing it in. Over the next few weeks, we saw each other less frequently, not out of distance or disinterest, but because we were both leaning into our own spaces. Marianne had started volunteering at a local literacy center and was working on a longer manuscript. She hoped to submit to a regional publisher. I was getting more work than usual as people prepared their homes for the upcoming season, and I found myself pouring more care into the little job-stightening porch rails. Restaining swing sets, replacing broken window panes. It felt good. To do work that would help people settle into their spaces as the world outside began to cool. In between jobs, I still wrote in my notepad, and every few days, I'd send Marianne a photo of something that reminded me of a line she'd written or a thought we'd shared. Sometimes she replied with a quote from a book, sometimes with nothing. More than a heart. That was enough. One Saturday, she invited me to a community reading event at the library, where she and some of her fellow writers were presenting excerpts from their works in progress. It wasn't as formal as the bookstore reading had been. There were kids running around, people sipping coffee from to-go cups, and folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. But it had charm. Marianne read second. Her voice was stronger now, more assured. She no longer looked out into the crowd for reassurance. She spoke from within herself, and the words landed exactly where they were meant to. When she finished, the applause was warm and immediate. I stood in the back and watched her glow beneath the modest lights. She had become someone entirely new, and yet still completely herself. After the event, we walked together down a quiet street, the sun casting a soft orange hue over the town. Not out of romance, but out of something. Deeper trust, familiarity, a shared chapter still being written. "I'm scared," she said suddenly, "about moving, about everything changing." I didn't offer reassurance.
How?
I didn't tell her not to be. I just said, "You're allowed to be," she nodded, gripping my arm a little tighter. "But I'm still going to do it," she said, and I believed her that night. I sat on my own porch and thought about what it meant to start over, not just in the dramatic, sweeping sense, but in the small, quiet ways, saying yes to a new routine, saying no to something that used to define. You choosing to believe you're allowed to want more? I wasn't sure where any of this was leading. I didn't need to be. What mattered was that for the first time in years, I wasn't standing still out of fear or habit. I was moving, slowly but deliberately, toward something I didn't yet have the words for, not I realized was enough for now. The next time I saw Marianne, the leaves had fully turned, her golden and amber hues carpeting the ground around her home like nature's own farewell letter to summer. She opened the door in a thick-knit sweater, a scarf loosely looped around her neck, and the scent of cinnamon drifting faintly from somewhere inside. She smiled wide when she saw me, a soft but genuine warmth in her eyes that reminded me of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was contentment. Maybe it was quiet pride. "I found a place," she said without even offering a hello, as if she couldn't hold it in any longer. I raised my eyebrows and she nodded, stepping aside, so I could come in. We sat at the kitchen table. It's the very same one we'd shared lunch over that first day, when her deck was still a project and not a finished piece of her healing. She pulled out her laptop and spun it around to show me. A modest cottage on the edge of a wooded area, just 20 minutes outside of town. It had large windows, a wraparound porch, and enough garden space to keep her busy every spring and summer. "It's quiet," she said. "It has space for a writing room. I can hear birds in the morning instead of traffic." She spoke. about it with the certainty of someone who had wrestled with the decision long enough to make peace with it. I didn't need to ask if she was sure. I could see it in her face. She was set to move in just under a month. Not because she was in a rush, but because the house had been waiting for her. At least that's how she described it. Some places don't feel like houses, she told me. They feel like invitations. We spent the next few hours sorting through some of her things, what to keep, what to give away, what to donate. The same attic we'd once climbed into together to pull out boxes now stood mostly empty. Her life was shedding its old layers, making room for new ones. There was something sacred about it, not dramatic or sorrowful, just intentional. Like pruning a tree so that it could grow stronger in spring. Over the next few weeks, I became her unofficial moving assistant. It wasn't something we ever discussed or planned. I just showed up whenever I had a free hour, and she always had a task ready. We packed books into boxes labeled by genre and author. We wrapped dishes in old t-shirts instead of newspaper, joking that her kitchenware would be the most stylishly protected in town. We pulled weeds from the garden one last time, not because she needed to, but because she said she wanted to leave. It looking cared for. It's a form of gratitude, she said, her gloved hands stained with soil. This house held me while I fell apart. It deserves a proper goodbye. Some afternoons we'd take a break and sit on the deck, sipping tea or coffee, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing small memories from our respective lives. She told me about a childhood trip to the ocean she'd never forgotten, how the salt air had felt like something ancient and familiar. I told her about a fishing trip with my father that had gone disastrously wrong, but had somehow become our favorite story to tell. These were not grand, life-altering tales. They were quiet glimpses into who we were beneath our routines and roles. It felt like we were slowly filling in each other's background colors, not rewriting the lines, just softening them with understanding. As moving day drew closer, I noticed subtle changes in her. She carried herself differently, lighter somehow, but also more rooted. There was a clarity in her decisions, a firmness in her voice when she spoke about what she wanted. One afternoon, as we were loading up the back of her SUV with more boxes, she turned to me and said, "You know, I used to be scared that I'd already lived all the meaningful parts of my life, that everything ahead was just going to be some watered-down version of what came before." She paused, her eyes scanning the horizon as if looking for the words. "But I don't feel that way anymore. Now it feels like I've just been gathering kindling. For the first time in years, I'm ready to light the match." I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't want to interrupt the power of her declaration. Eventually I said, "That's the bravest thing I've heard in a long time." "Boss." She smiled, a soft private smile, like she'd just made a promise to herself and intended to keep it. "It's not bravery," she said. "It's overdue self-respect." The morning of the move was crisp and cloudless. We started early, the air still holding on to the last chill of night. Friends from her writing group came to help, along with a few neighbors she'd grown close to over the years. It was a gentle, communal kind of farewell, the kind where laughter made the lifting easier and shared stories filled the gaps between carloads. Watched as she said goodbye to each room of her house in her own quiet way. No tears, just hands trailing along familiar door frames, eyes pausing on the corners where sun hit the walls just right, and one last slow walk through the garden. She didn't need closure. Okay, she needed continuity. And that's exactly what this new place would give her, not an escape, but an evolution. We caravanned to her new home with trunks full and hearts both light and heavy. The drive was peaceful, the roads winding through open fields and patches of early turning trees. When we arrived, she walked the perimeter of the property with a slow, deliberate pace, like she was introducing herself to the land. Inside, the house smelled of pine and potential. We unloaded box after box, arranging things not for functionality, but for comfort. Her writing room was the last to be set up. She placed her desk by the window that faced east, where the morning light spilled in generously. Then she hung a small framed quote above it, one I hadn't seen before. "Start again, and again, and again." She caught me looking and said, "It's my new mantra. No matter how late it feels, no matter how many times it takes." Later that evening, As the sun dipped low and the sky turned to soft lavender, we sat on her new porch, drinking tea. The birds she'd promised were indeed singing in the nearby trees, and the air was clean in a way that felt medicinal.
Thank
You, she said, not looking at me, but at the view. Not just for helping me move, for being here for all of it. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't dilute the weight of her gratitude, so I just nodded. That seemed enough. That night, driving home under a sky thick with stars, I thought about how many people go their entire lives without ever choosing to start over. How many stay stuck in stories they stopped believing in long ago. When here was Marianne at 46, doing the exact thing she once believed was too late for her. She had proven something not just to herself, but to anyone watching closely enough, that reinvention doesn't require permission, just courage. That the right time is not something that arrives, it's something you decide to claim. And that, maybe, just maybe, the most beautiful chapters of our lives are the ones we're brave enough to write ourselves. A few weeks after Marianne's move, I found myself thinking about her more often than I expected. I'd drive past old houses I'd worked on and half expect to see her waving from the porch or bent over in her garden. That quiet space she'd filled in my life hadn't disappeared, it had simply changed shape. The daily calls were less frequent, but they carried more weight. When she did ring, her voice held a new clarity. As if the air around her in that cottage had made it easier to breathe, to speak, to think. She talked about long walks in the woods behind her new place, about hearing her own voice in the silence and not finding it unbearable anymore. There was something about the way she described her solitude now as loneliness, but as peace earned, a choice rather than a consequence. I'd listen, often sitting in my truck between jobs or out on my own porch, and realize that while I'd been there to help her rebuild her deck, she'd been helping me rebuild something to something I hadn't even named yet. Work had picked up as autumn deepened. People were trying to finish projects before winter, and I found my days full of siding repairs, door replacements, insulation work, and fixing things that people had put off all year. I liked the pace, the rhythm, the simple satisfaction of tasks that had clear beginnings and ends. But I also found myself wondering more often if this was still enough. It's not that I didn't enjoy the work I did, but something had shifted inside me. Some part that used to be dormant now quietly stirring. I started noticing the kinds of homes that had quiet corners and good light. I found myself sketching out plans in the margins of invoices or jotting down thoughts that had nothing to do with repairs. Maybe it was Marianne's influence, or maybe it was something deeper I hadn't yet given permission to surface. I knew was that I felt like I was at the edge of something, not sure whether to step forward or let it pass. One cold morning, just before the first frost was expected, I got a call from Marianne. She was laughing when I picked up, her voice lighter than I'd ever heard it. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "I just signed up to teach a writing workshop." I leaned back against my truck and let her words settle. "At the community center," she went on. "They were short on instructors, and someone from the library recommended me. I almost said no, but then I heard myself saying yes." I smiled. Not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. This was the woman she was becoming. Someone who said yes to herself. Someone who no longer waited for the world to give her permission. She asked me if I'd help her build a small standing desk from some reclaimed wood she'd found at a nearby salvage yard. Something simple, she said, functional, but full of story. I told her I'd be there Saturday morning when I arrived. She had everything laid out, planks, tools, even a small thermos of coffee waiting for me on the porch. We worked quietly for most of the morning, the kind of silence that felt productive and companionable. She held the wood steady while I sanded, and I handed her nails while she carefully lined up each board. By noon, we had something sturdy and beautiful, a simple desk with imperfect edges and knots that told their own history. She ran her hands over the surface slowly, reverently. "This is where I'll help others find their voice," she said, almost to herself. I looked at her then, not as a project, not as someone healing, but as someone fully arrived. There was strength in her now, but not the brittle kind that comes from pretending. This was earned strength, rooted in truth, in Having let herself fall apart just enough to grow back differently, after we cleaned up, she asked if I'd stay for lunch. I agreed, and we sat on her porch eating sandwiches and sipping warm cider. The trees around her cottage were a mix of rust and fire, the wind carrying just a hint of winter in its breath. She talked about her students, most of them older women, who, like her, had stories they'd kept buried beneath years of obligation and silence. They're scared, she said, but they keep showing up, and they're starting to write things they didn't think they could say out loud. I listened, struck by the full-circle nature of it all. How just a few months ago she'd been the one unsure, afraid to call herself a writer, and now here she was, giving others the space and safety to step into their own truths. It was humbling to witness. As the day wore on, we walked through her property, her boots crunching over the fallen leaves. She showed me a small clearing near the edge of the woods, where she hoped to build a bench someday. A reading spot, she said, or maybe just a place to sit when the world feels too loud. I promised to help her build it when she was ready. Then we stood for a long moment, the two of us just looking out into the distance, the quiet settling around us like a familiar friend. Do you ever think about what comes next? She asked. All the time, I admitted, but I try not to chase the answer anymore. She nodded slowly. Me too. It's strange. I thought the move was the end of something, but now it feels more like an opening. That night, on my drive back home, I turned off the radio and let the silence fill the cab. I thought about all the ways life had quietly changed without grand announcements or sweeping transformations. Just steady, deliberate moments, one after another. I remembered that first day on her deck, how she had seemed both guarded and hopeful, and how I had shown up thinking it was just another job. And now, here we were, seasons later, both a little more ourselves, because we had allowed space for each other to grow. I thought about how some stories don't need dramatic arcs or explosive endings. Sometimes the most meaningful stories are the ones that unfold slowly, gently over time, without force, without pressure. Just two people learning that starting over isn't about becoming someone new, but about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. As I pulled into my driveway, the last rays of sunlight slipping behind the hills, I knew something had shifted in me too. I wasn't just fixing things for other people anymore. I was beginning to mend something inside myself. An old belief that life had passed me by. That there was no more magic in the ordinary. Marianne had reminded me that change doesn't have to be loud. That sometimes it begins with a conversation on a worn-out deck. That sometimes it begins with a question that lingers in the airs. It too late to start over? And ends with a quiet, steady answer it never was. The first snow fell quietly, as if the sky didn't want to disturb the silence that had settled over everything. It came earlier than usual that year, catching most of the town by surprise, covering the roofs and trees in a soft layer of white before anyone had a chance to brace themselves. I was finishing up a porch repair job on the other side of town when Marianne called, not to ask for anything, just to say the snow looked beautiful through her writing room window. I could hear the excitement in her voice, the same kind you hear in a child who's just woken up to a snow day. She told me how she'd lit a fire in her small wood stove and was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a mug of cocoa, rereading something she'd written months ago. It sounds like someone else wrote it, she laughed, but in a good way. Like I can see the version of me who needed to write those words, and I just want to hug her. I didn't say much, just let her talk, knowing that sometimes people don't call to be answered, they call to be witnessed. The snowfall brought a natural pause to my work schedule. Clients postponed outdoor repairs, and even the most urgent jobs waited until the ice cleared. I spent a few slow days at home, fixing little things around my own place that I'd neglected. A loose cabinet hinge, a flickering porch light, a drawer that always stuck just enough to be annoying. As I worked through them, I kept thinking about how we often put off tending to our own spaces while we're busy tending to others. There was something symbolic about it, this sudden attention to the small dysfunctions I'd learned to live with. I wasn't just repairing objects, I was realigning with myself. And in the quiet between tasks, I kept returning to a question I hadn't asked aloud yet. Was I content, or was I simply comfortable? That week, I drove out to Marianne's place with no tools, no lumber, no agenda, just a batch of oatmeal cookies I'd made from an old recipe card my mother used to keep, tucked in the kitchen drawer. She greeted me at the door wrapped in a thick sweater, her cheeks pink from the cold. Her cottage smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke, and there was a calm in the air that wrapped around you the moment you stepped inside. We ate cookies by the fire, talking about nothing in particular. She showed me the first pages of a short story she was working on, and I read them slowly, taking in every word. It was different from anything I'd seen her write before, braver, sharper, more honest. It's not finished, she said, a little nervously, but I think it's where I need to go. I told her it didn't feel like a beginning or an ending. It felt like arrival. Later, we took a walk through the woods behind her house, our boots crunching in the fresh snow, the cold sharp but not punishing. The trees stood bare and still, as if watching us pass. We didn't say much at first. Just walked side by side, the way people do when words would only clutter something already understood. Eventually, she said, I used to be afraid of winter, not just the cold, but what it represented. The stillness, the waiting, the lack of color. She paused, picking up a small pinnacone from the ground and turning it in her gloved hand. Now it feels like a kind of grace. It's like the world finally gives you permission to stop and just ... be. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. There's a strange kind of peace in winter when you stop fighting it. A stillness that doesn't demand productivity. It's just presence. We reached the clearing where she'd said she wanted to build her bench. It was just as quiet as before, the snow smoothing out the land into a clean slate. She stood in the center of it, then looked back at me. Next spring, she said softly, we'll build it here. I told her I'd bring the tools, and she could bring the ideas. It felt good to have a plan, even one that wouldn't happen for months. Something to look forward to, something rooted in continuity. As we walked back to the house, the sky began to darken, and the first stars blinked awake above the trees. Back inside, she made soup while I stacked more firewood near the stove. There was something domestic in our movements, but it wasn't romantic. It was something older than that, something built on trust and shared time and the mutual understanding of what it meant to rebuild your life after the structure of it had collapsed. After dinner, she pulled out a photo album, and we sat on the rug flipping through pages filled with snapshots of her younger years. Trips she took in her 20s, birthdays with her family, grainy photos from college with laughing faces frozen in time. She lingered over one photo in particular, her standing on a balcony in Rome, a notebook in her hand, sunlight flooding her face. I thought I had it all figured out then, she said. Turns out I was just beginning. I looked at her, and for a moment I saw the girl in that photo still living inside her, the dreamer, the believer, the storyteller. Before I left, that night, she walked me to the door and gave me a hug that lingered. Not because it was romantic, but because it was necessary. I'm really glad you were the one who came to fix my deck, she whispered. Me too, I replied, and I meant it more than she probably knew. Driving home, I thought about how strange and beautiful it was that something as simple as a repair job could lead to all this, a friendship that felt like family, a reminder of the parts of myself I'd left behind, a quiet revolution of purpose that had begun with one unexpected question: is it too late to start over? Snow continued to fall that night, blanketing everything in silence, and yet nothing felt still. Underneath it all, I sensed movement, not the frantic kind, but the slow, intentional turning of pages in a story still being written and for. The first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing how it would end. The holidays rolled in slowly, bringing with them a quiet sort of nostalgia that always settled deep in the bones. Streets lit up with modest decorations, store windows filled with reds and golds, and you could hear faint music drifting from cafes and open doors. I'd always found the holidays a bit hollow in recent years to commercial. Too loud, too full of pressure disguised as celebration. But that December felt different. Not because anything monumental had changed, but because for once, I felt like I was carrying more presence than weight. There was something grounding about this season, maybe because I'd watched someone cared about rebuild herself not through a grand gesture, but through daily acts of courage that no one clapped for. It shifted something in me like a mirror turned gently inward. I hadn't planned on doing much for Christmas, maybe just a dinner at my sister's, some small gifts, nothing complicated. But a week before the 25th, Marianne called and asked if I'd come over that afternoon. She sounded calm but deliberate, like the invitation wasn't just casual. I made the drive through soft flurries, the sky a pale gray that stretched forever. Her place looked like a postcard's string lights across the porch. A small tree visible through the front window, and smoke rising steadily from the chimney. When she opened the door, I noticed she was holding a wooden box, carefully sanded and painted about the size of a large book. "I made you something," she said, a little sheepish. "We're always the one building things for everyone else. I figured it was time you had something from me." I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking just slightly. Inside was a collection of handwritten pages, short reflections, pieces of conversations we'd had, even some sketches she'd done of the deck in different seasons. There was no index, no table of contents, just a living, breathing timeline of our strange, gentle friendship. "Not a book," she said. "It's just ... fragments, but they're yours too." I didn't know what to say. I ran my hand across the pages, recognizing some of the phrases, smiling at others I'd forgotten. It was unlike any gift I'd ever received. Not expensive, not elaborate, but impossibly rich. I looked up at her, and she just nodded, as if to say, "I know." She made hot cider, and we sat by the fire, the box on my lap, the quiet hum of an old holiday song playing in the background. "This is my first Christmas alone," she said after a while, "and yet ... I don't feel alone. Isn't that strange?" I told her it wasn't strange at all, that sometimes we're more alone in rooms full of people than we are in the silence of our own homes. She looked at me like she understood that truth in her bones, like it had taken her years to say it, out loud, without feeling guilty. We talked about small things, how neither of us could bake to save our lives, how she'd once burned a batch of gingerbread cookies so badly the pan had to be thrown out. We laughed about things we used to dread that now felt so distant. They were almost funny, awkward work parties, family expectations, the pressure to seem okay even when we weren't. It wasn't a celebration in the traditional sense, but it was intimate and honest and exactly what the day needed to be as I left. That evening, she handed me another envelope. "Don't open it until Christmas morning," she said, "and promise me you'll do what it says." I raised an eyebrow, but she just smiled, and I didn't push it. I drove home under a sky thick with clouds, wondering what kind of instructions she could possibly give that required secrecy. When Christmas morning came, I opened it carefully. Inside was a single note that read, "Go somewhere unfamiliar, even just for a day. Take the long road, leave your phone at home, let silence show you what comfort never could." I stared at it for a long moment, then folded it back into the envelope, and I did exactly what she said. I waited until December 27th to follow Marianne's instructions, letting the holiday haze pass before I packed a small thermos of coffee, a notebook, and a scarf she'd once told me looked too good to just hang on a coat hook. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I only knew I'd head west, away from town, past the farmlands that gave way to low hills and forgotten side roads. There was something oddly freeing about leaving my phone behind. I wasn't being brave. I was just surrendering to the quiet, hoping maybe silence had something to tell me that noise never could. The roads were mostly empty, save for a few delivery trucks and lone travelers like me. With no radio and no texts pinging in the background, the sound of the tires against asphalt became its own kind of melody, a rhythm that lulled me into a rare kind of presence. Every tree, every turn, every wide-open sky felt like it had been waiting patiently for someone to notice it. About 2 hours in, I stumbled onto a small overlook tucked off the main road, just beyond a crooked wooden sign that read Raven's Hill. I parked the truck and stepped out into a wind that carried the sharp bite of winter, but also the strange comfort of solitude. The view stretched for miles, rolling white hills, patches of pine trees, a frozen creek slicing through the valley. Like a silver ribbon, stood at the edge for a long time, letting the cold press against my skin, letting the silence speak. Couldn't remember the last time I just stood still with no objective, no deadline, no task, no obligation. Just breath and snow and a sky so wide it made you feel both small and held at once. I found a flat rock nearby and sat down, sipping coffee from the thermos and pulling out the notebook. I didn't plan to write anything profound. In fact, I didn't plan to write at all, but words came anyway. Not full sentences at first, just fragments. Questions, loose memories. Moments that had stuck to the edges of my mind like frost on a window pane. I wrote about the first time I saw Marianne's deck, how crooked it looked, how unsure she had seemed. I wrote about the smell of sawdust and warm cider, the curve of her handwriting on old notebook pages, the sound of her laugh when it caught her by surprise. And then I wrote about myself, things I hadn't said out loud, even in my own head. The weight of time, fear of disappearing into routine. The quiet hope that maybe starting over wasn't a privilege reserved for the young or the reckless. I stayed there for over an hour, the wind chapping my face, my hands numb but my heart steady. When I finally stood to leave, I felt different. Not fixed, not transformed, but grounded. Like I had shaken something loose and left it there on that hilltop, offering it to the silence as a kind of exchange. On the drive home, the roads looked the same, but didn't feel the same. And when I pulled into my driveway, I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the truck with the notebook still open, rereading the pages, feeling the kind of warmth that doesn't come from blankets or firewood, but from returning to yourself after a long time away. A few days later, I drove back out to Marianne's. She greeted me on the porch, holding 2 mugs of coffee and smiling like she already knew what I'd done. We didn't talk about the trip, not directly, but in the way we moved around each other, in the way she handed me a cinnamon roll without asking if I was hungry, I knew she understood. I told her I had a favor to ask, and when she looked at me, eyebrows raised in curiosity, I said, "Let's build that bench in the woods, now, even if it's cold." She grinned, not because of the idea, but because she knew what it meant. We spent the rest of the afternoon gathering wood from her shed, layering ourselves in gloves and scarves, trudging through snow to that same clearing behind the cottage. The earth was frozen, but we found a way. We worked side by side, the sound of hammering and sawing echoing into the trees. There was no rush, no blueprint, just the quiet intention to create something lasting in a place where we had both let go of who we thought we needed to be. When we finally placed the bench against the tree and stepped back to look at it, we said nothing. We just sat, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun sink behind the hills, the last light turning the snow into gold. It wasn't the end of anything. It wasn't the beginning either. It was a moment suspended in the middle of both, and for once, that was more than enough. The weeks that followed moved with the slow grace of winter, each day folding into the next with quiet purpose. Marianne and I continued to speak often, but there was a new cadence to our conversations, less frequent perhaps, but more grounded, more intentional. It was as if that bench we built had somehow marked a turning point, not in the sense that anything was ending or beginning, but more like we had finally named the season we were in. It wasn't romance. It wasn't limbo. It was something more settled than either of those things. Friendship so deeply rooted that it didn't require definitions to survive. One early January morning, I found myself revisiting the pages I'd scribbled in my notebook from Raven's Hill, flipping through the words, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Some of the lines still rang true. Others had already started to feel distant, as though I was reading the thoughts of someone I used to be. It made me wonder how much of life is simply the act of becoming reacquainted with yourself over and over again. I spent more time at home during those weeks, working on small woodworking projects, clearing out my garage, even repainting the kitchen cabinets I'd ignored for years. There was something meditative about it, this idea of making old things feel new again. Marianne had started her writing workshop at the community center, and every now and then she'd send me excerpts from her students, Shira. Unpolished pieces filled with vulnerability and strength. She never named them, never told me whose story it was, but I could feel the heartbeat behind each word. One in particular stuck with me. We spend so much time trying to become someone worthy of love, when maybe we were worthy all along. We just needed someone to sit still long enough to see us. I read that line 3 times, then copied it into my own notebook. It didn't matter who had written it. The truth in it belonged to everyone. Sometime mid-January, a storm rolled in. Hard and fast, the kind that knocks out power and blankets everything in thick, quiet snow. I checked in on Marianne and offered to bring firewood if she needed it, but she assured me she was stocked and safe, her voice warm with gratitude. Still, I found myself driving out to her cottage anyway, not because I didn't trust her, but because some part of me just needed to see her light on through the storm. When I pulled up, her window glowed amber through the white. And for a long moment, I just sat there in the truck watching the snow swirl around the house. It reminded me of the first time I drove there months earlier when I had no idea who she was or how much she'd come to mean to me. She opened the door before I even knocked, smiling like she'd been expecting me all along. We spent the evening talking by the fire, sipping tea, listening to the wind howl outside. She read me one of her own stories, this one about a woman who returns to the home she grew up in and finds it smaller than she remembered, but filled with echoes that make her feel whole. There was something achingly familiar in the way she described the woman walking room to room, not looking for anything in particular, just remembering who she was when the world was simpler. When she finished reading, she closed the notebook and looked over at me, her expression unreadable but soft. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Sometimes the right response is silence. Before I left, I stood on her porch for a while, watching the snow settle on the branches like thick lace. The air was sharp and cold, but neither of us moved. She turned to me and said, almost absent-mindedly, I used to think starting over meant changing everything, but now I think it just means changing enough to hear your own voice again. I nodded, letting her words root themselves somewhere deep. I drove home that night through thick snow and darker roads, but the path felt clear, not just physically, but emotionally. I wasn't lost in this season of my life. I was just learning how to move through it without rushing. February arrived quietly, with the kind of steady chill that no longer felt like an interruption, just part of the rhythm of things. By then, the snow had become a part of the landscape's memory, piled neatly along sidewalks and rooftops, shaping the edges of the world like soft parentheses. My work picked up again as people began preparing for the thaw. But even the pace of labor felt different now, more deliberate, less frantic. There was a calmness to each project, a kind of respect for the passage of time. I no longer rushed through repairs just to check off a list. I was noticing more the way wood held warmth from sunlight, how old nails left behind stories in rust stains, how silence lingered even after the sound of hammering faded. It was in that slower attention that I began to feel something stirring. In me, not quite an idea, not yet a decision, but the early shape of change forming quietly at the back of my mind. Marianne's writing classes were in full swing, and she'd begun hosting Sunday readings in her living room, inviting her students to share their work in a space without judgment. She asked me to come by once, not to critique or offer feedback, just to sit in and listen. I arrived with a box of pastries from the local bakery and found a group of 5 women gathered around her coffee table, notebooks in hand, nervous laughter dancing between them. The youngest couldn't have been more than 20, the oldest in her 60s. But they all spoke with the same tentative bravery, voices cracking slightly under the weight of honesty, hands fidgeting with pages, eyes darting up for reaction. Each story was different, but they all shared a common thread, the ache of becoming something more, becoming someone new, becoming unafraid. I sat quietly, letting their words wash over me, and realized this wasn't just about writing it was about release. These women weren't just sharing stories, they were shedding skins. After they left, I helped Marianne wash the dishes, the clatter of mugs and plates echoing softly against the hum of her satisfaction. They remind me of myself, she said, not with pride, but with empathy. Lost, I felt, trying to put language to things I didn't even know I had the right to say. She glanced at me as if searching for permission to be vulnerable, though she'd earned it 100 times over. "Do you ever think about teaching?" she asked. "Not just tools and building, but this life, living through it?" The question caught me off guard. I'd never thought of myself as someone who taught others anything outside of nails, angles, and pressure points. But as I looked at her, I realized maybe I had, not by lecturing, not with theory, but by showing up, by being present, by holding space without filling it. That night back home, I couldn't shake the thought. What if I did more than fix things? What if I started telling the stories behind the repairs, the people, the moments, the quiet truths hidden beneath every beam and floorboard? I began jotting down notes, not full paragraphs, just moments that had stuck with me over the years. The man who never touched the attic because it still smelled like his late wife's perfume. The mother who asked me to build a bookshelf so her daughter would know their new apartment could be a home. And now Marianne, a woman who had asked me without shame or fear if 46 was too late to start over. And in doing so, had reminded me that every person I met was rebuilding something, whether they admitted it or not. I realized I'd been collecting stories this whole time, not on purpose, not for any audience, but as a kind of map, each one pointing toward a life lived slowly, intentionally, with reverence for what had been broken and the grace it took to begin again. Maybe that's what starting over really looked like. It's not a blank slate, not a grand reset, but the gentle gathering of everything that had led you here, reshaped not with force, but with patience. Spring came in like a quiet apology, with soft rains and pale green leaves unfurling like second chances. The snow melted slowly, revealing patches of earth that had waited all winter to be touched by light again. On one of those warmer afternoons, I returned to the bench in the woods behind Marianne's cottage. She wasn't home that day, teaching a class or maybe at the bookstore, but I didn't mind. I brought coffee, that same old notebook, and sat alone beneath the trees that had stood patient and unmoving through every season we had known together. The bench creaked gently beneath my weight, weathered now by snow and wind, but still strong, still holding. I traced the grain of the wood with my fingertips and thought about everything that had changed in such a short span of time. Not just in Marianne's world, but in mine. It was strange to think that it had all begun with a simple repair job, a crooked deck, an unsure homeowner, and a man who thought he'd just hammer in a few nails and move on. But the truth is, people don't always come into your life with fanfare or fate. Sometimes they just arrived, hesitant, a little broken, and you don't realize until much later how much they've reshaped the edges of your life. Marianne hadn't tried to reinvent herself with big declarations. She hadn't run away, changed her name, or forced some artificial reinvention. She stayed. She faced the quiet of her home, the ache of her history, the echo of her own voice. And day by day she made space for something new, not by erasing what had been, but by forgiving it. And I, in turn, learned how to be still, to listen more than I fixed, to notice more than I planned, to let people unfold on their own time, without forcing them into roles they hadn't chosen. I didn't know if I'd ever find someone the way movies like to promise: no sweeping romance, no grand finale, but I had found something just as rare, a connection built not on chemistry or timing, but on truth, on presence, on being there when it mattered, and saying nothing when that mattered more. A few weeks later, Marianne stopped by my place with 2 tickets to a storytelling event in a nearby town. "You've been gathering stories for years," she said. "It's time to share one." I laughed, a little nervous, but agreed. We sat near the back, listening to strangers bare their hearts on stage, some trembling, others bold, each voice holding the same truth. We're all just trying to find our way back to ourselves. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the mic. With hands that weren't quite steady, but a heart that finally was, I told the story of a deck and a woman who didn't ask to be saved, just seen. I told them how she taught me that 46 isn't too late to start over, that no age is, that sometimes all we need is someone to sit beside us while we take the first uncertain step. The room was silent when I finished, not out of discomfort, but reverence. And in that silence, I felt the full weight of what we'd built together. After the event, we drove back in silence, the kind that held more than words could ever carry. When we reached her house, she didn't get out immediately. She looked at me with a quiet smile and said, "This is what starting over feels like, isn't it?" I nodded, because it was. Not dramatic, not loud, just honest, simple, real. We still talk often. We still drink coffee on porches and send each other fragments of stories we hear or remember. We don't label what we are. We don't need to. What we have is enough. Maybe that's the point of it. All not to chase after something shiny and new, but to recognize the value in what's already here, already growing, already healing. Because sometimes starting over doesn't mean beginning again. It means beginning differently, with more kindness, more patience, and more room for all the versions of ourselves we've carried to this moment. And that's what she gave me. Not a love story, something better. A life redefined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,